Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to disaster recovery, business continuity, crisis management, COVID, anything that's relatable to those subjects, and anything that helps you, your organization, or your community prepare for, respond to, and overcome adverse situations. If there's a topic you'd like us to talk about on the show, please feel free, send me an email. You can do that on the Voice America page. For the radio show, there's a button underneath the graphic. I do respond to all emails, and if you're watching the video, there's a link to my LinkedIn profile. You can reach out to me that way with any questions or topics, and we'll see about you getting your topic on the show or getting you on the show. If you'd like to promote any product or service, you can reach me the same way. I'd like to thank everybody at Stone Road for sponsoring today's show and allowing us to film and record today's episode, and their product, boastassessment.com, that allows you to track your business continuity management programs and align your resources appropriately as you build your program. Today, I would like to welcome back someone who I talked to actually not that long ago. So I'd like to have a big welcome back to the show, Stuart Hotchkiss. Scott, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex.
Now, just in case there are people who didn't listen to the last episode, there might be a couple, but just in case, can you give us a quick bio about yourself, what you do, and how you got to where you are today?
Well, right now, I'm essentially, for all intents and purposes, retired, freelance consulting. I've worked in the IT industry as a consultant in security and business continuity, crisis management. I started my life for 30 odd years, a little bit longer. Started my life as an application programmer. I've worked for most of the big names in the IT industry. And I currently live in France, or I was working in Switzerland. I spent a lot of time in Belgium and a lot of time in the UK, obviously, since I'm English of origin. So yeah, I've written a book on business continuity planning. I'm currently writing a book on crisis management in practice, but it's causing me a bit of a problem because what I've written down, which I think is the essential in the subject, is pretty short. It's only 25 pages. And that's not really enough for a book. But I think it illustrates the point which I would like to make, which is that you can make this subject very, very complicated and write long books, so you can write short books. And I definitely believe in doing things in the simple way, the short way, if possible. And crisis management tends to suffer from people making the subject more complicated than it need be and getting themselves in a mess as a result. But we'll talk about that in a minute.
And I just want to make mention of your book. It's titled Business Continuity Management in Practice, which is actually what we spoke about the last time.
That's right, yeah. That's right.
So today, and you already touched on it, we are going to be talking about crisis management. So let's jump straight into it and get to the point. How do you define a crisis? What's the definition of crisis management?
If you had to try and define one, you would start to look for characteristics. So I'm not going to say, COVID is a crisis. I'm not going to say that a flood is a crisis and so on and so forth. You can't actually say that an individual event is a crisis. It becomes a crisis by its characteristics. Is it something which will potentially impact your organization in more than one place? Will its impact be extended? Will the impact potentially become fatal for you and your organization? And so on. So there are a lot of things that people say are crises which are not crises. Now, I can give you a classic example of this. A lot of people would say that Ebola was a crisis. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Not you, it's not. It wasn't. It wasn't a medical crisis, at least. Because if you look at the number of deaths from Ebola, in comparison with the number of deaths per year from other diseases like flu and COVID, amongst other things, it was by no means a crisis in terms of numbers. Okay, a lot of people said it was. It was badly managed for lots of reasons which we can go into, but it was not really a crisis. It didn't impact very many people. I know it's bad for the people who were impacted, sure, but in terms of raw numbers, it didn't impact that many. It didn't devastate countries to the point that the countries no longer existed, which could happen with a company. Um, so, for example, if we relate this to the way a company performs, if you had a product quality problem, your company could go out of business. Okay, the reputational damage could be that people would stop buying from you. So that is something which you really need to take care of, and it could easily become a crisis, which could eliminate your company from the market. Whereas if your head office burnt down and you had no access to that site and 3,000 people couldn't get to work, is that a crisis? It's certainly a big event. It's certainly difficult to manage. It's not necessarily a crisis because it may not impact your performance as a company. So it's very, to define a crisis in terms of things that people recognize is extremely dangerous. I think that the important thing to remember is what you think is a crisis and what I think is a crisis can be two totally different things.
Does
Some
it
people,
does it really need to? A crisis is something that could either put you out of business or puts you in some sort of jeopardy.
that would be a better way to define it for certain. But I think that the important thing is that the people who are running the organization need to sit around the table and say, what do we think is a crisis? Because when we define what is a crisis to us, that has certain implications. The first implication being that we're going to have to manage it in a different way. So if you're head of finance, right, in a crisis, yeah, you have a financial hat, but you're a member of the crisis management team, and your role has suddenly changed, right? So the traditional management structure of a company or an organization during a crisis, by definition, disappears. So you now form a team with other people, and your joint task is to manage that crisis as a team. So you can't sort of come into the team and say, oh, well, yeah, I'm the finance guy, so don't ask me any hard questions or ask me to make decisions in other areas. You are part of now a crisis management team. And a crisis, when we sit down and define what a crisis is for us, we have to say, well, is it so important to us that we're going to have to override the company organization? Because that's one of the very first things you need to do. You cannot exist in little silos, as companies tend to, for good reason. When a crisis comes along, it's everybody's in the same boat. So what sorts of things are we going to actually say merit such a radical change in behavior for us? And we can come up with a certain number of events. We say, well, if this happens, or if this happens. And in practice, what you really need to do to manage a crisis is not actually define what a crisis is. You need to define the structure that you would put in place to handle a crisis if you had one. So you put in place a crisis management team. You put in an escalation path where people can bring events to somebody who says, well, yeah, this is so important, we have to go to the team. You bring in a certain number of guidelines, and you bring in obviously things like checklists, things that you might want to check before, after, or during a crisis. And you put all of that in place and you wait for something to happen. And one day somebody will say, this could really cause us a problem. We have got hundreds of customers completely dissatisfied, whether it be trading customers or just people who are getting service from a government department. This could cause us irreparable damage. And it may be something that we will not get under control unless we actually take centralized control of it. Because
that's an interesting point right there,
yeah.
where you said getting it under control, because having, many of us having worked for different organizations, we have daily incidents or interruptions. So are you saying that a crisis actually is where we don't, some of the processes we have in place to deal with those daily interruptions can't be or aren't dealt with properly and need to be dealt with at a higher level, or bring more people in, that the impact may not be known because of this interruption. Like, it's taking us beyond our normal business as usual responses.
It's a good definition. And let me just come back to one point you mentioned. If you look at an incident, very, very often an incident is manageable by one part of the organization. We have a delivery problem. Okay, well, it's the delivery organization. We have a severe financial problem. We have a warehouse is burnt, or an office is burnt down, or is affected by weather or some such thing. It's one organization, sub-organization that will deal with that. When something goes beyond more than one internal organization, sub-organization, you can start to think, well, this is not a classic incident that can be handled by standard management knowledge and procedures. And I think that's an important thing. If I were running part of the organization, there's certain things I won't be allowed to do because it's outside my sub-organization. And as soon as you start seeing that, you start to think, well, maybe we need a multidisciplinary team to handle this event, because it's going to be beyond an individual sub-organization. I don't know what's going to happen. I'm going to have to make some radical decisions, which I have to make quickly. I can't sort of say, oh, I think the way to fix this is to do the following, and I'll have to go to the finance guy to get some money. No, you've got like 30 minutes. You don't have 3 weeks. So there are things which indicate that you potentially could get out of control and need to special things. One of the problems I have about crisis management is that people always tend to define it in terms of dramatic events, flooding, and tornadoes and stuff like that. And it's completely beyond me that in countries where you get tornadoes 10 times a year, why every single one's a crisis. It's not.
Well, what's the difference then between crisis and disaster? If organizations are doing that, there's got to be a difference between the two.
That's just a word that people. It's almost as though once they've used the word a few years, it gets out of fashion. So let's have a new one. What is the difference between a crisis and a disaster? To me, they're the same word. I don't see any noticeable difference between a disaster and a crisis. You could argue that a crisis could turn into a disaster, but I don't even know what disaster means, and I don't like the word disaster because it's too emotive, and it's almost as though, well, things are now out of our control, so let's sit back and watch. No, crisis is something you can manage, just like the supposed disaster is something you can manage. But I wouldn't differentiate between the two terms personally.
Okay. Now, you also mentioned, the crisis management team. So, who is a part of that team, and how do they become members of this CMT? How are they defined?
Normally, when you build up a CMT, you have a leader, and the CMT leader will have somebody who we often call a coordinator, somebody who will help him get things together. He should normally be sensible enough, if he's the leader of the company, to recognize that he needs the leader of every functional area. He needs his finance guy, he needs his salespeople, he needs his sales guy, he needs his marketing guy, he needs communications, HR, facilities, security, etc., etc. All of those sub-functions need to be represented on the team, because if they're not, can't possibly make decisions. But there's one important thing that the people need to understand, is that once they're in this crisis management team, they're a member of the team first and functional managers second, right? Mm. Everybody in that, and that's something which is very difficult sometimes for functional managers to understand, that their role has changed, and that the CMT is a new organization which supplants the organization of the company or the organization to date for the duration of the management of the crisis. Allowing people to continue to only have their functional responsibility and reneging the responsibility to manage as a team is a big mistake. And this is up to the manager of the CMT to fix. There's no magic formula. You've just got to say, you're now a member of the CMT, and the CMT makes decisions together. You are part of the decision-making process, full stop. You have an expertise, yes, but you're part of the team. And that in itself is one of the first lessons that you need to manage, to get in place to manage crisis. Now, I go back to Ebola. The Ebola situation suffered from lots of problems, like we can almost see in some countries with COVID today. Is there a team where all the team members are pulling in the same direction? Was there a team with Ebola? The answer, no, there wasn't. There was the UN saying what should happen. There was some countries saying that we agree, and some countries saying maybe. Within the country, there was no management capability. In other words, nobody was able to say you will do this or you won't do that. So everybody did, both at an international and a local level, what they thought was the right thing to do. There was no leadership, right? If there had been leadership, but of course, it's a big problem with an organization like the United Nations trying to manage multiple countries and tell them what to do. It's exactly the same situation we have with COVID today, where the WHO, for lots of reasons, cannot, has not, and will never be able to dictate and have a CMT, if you like, run by the WHO, of which the members are each individual country, have a situation where each country does a different thing.
That would be huge.
And in the countries as well, we've got the problem that, different organizations in the countries do different things. And you see varying results country by country as a consequence. So there's no real synchronization of efforts. And this is the thing that makes these crises worse. And it makes a crisis worse in the company. If you can't get a CMT that says, we make the law, and that's the end of it.
Now, I'd like to talk about crisis management policy. How do you go about creating a policy? And who's involved with that? And with the crisis management team, to take what you were saying in the first segment a step farther, what are some of the roles and responsibilities of people that are on these teams that get assigned to be a part of these teams?
Right. Well, let's talk about policy first. Firstly, the policy should be simple and short. If it's long, it'll never work, never be understood. When you write a policy, you certainly never, should never, but most people always do, use words like ought and should and guideline and could. Eliminate all those words for a start. A policy has to be a clear, simple statement of what we're going to do. And normally, a policy should state, in certain circumstances, which we will define as a crisis, the company will behave in the following way. We will assign a crisis management team. The crisis management team will make decisions on behalf of all function areas. All function areas will be involved in the crisis management team. You should have a scope statement that says, it applies to everybody. Usually it applies to everybody. You should have an applicability statement, which basically should say, who it applies to and how it should be applied. And that's it. Make it very, very simple. That you're making people aware in advance. And when I say people, it's not just your employees. It's also your customers. Right? The customer needs to know, for example, that in the situation of a crisis, the company who serves you will behave in the following way. It may ask you information. It may do certain things. For example, If I were Amazon, I might say my crisis management policy, which I send to all customers, says, in the event of a crisis, and this sounds really simple, our deliveries may be delayed by up to 2 days. For example, there are certain things that you can predict will happen. You may want to say that in the event of a crisis involving certain parts of our organization which are out of our control, certain things we currently do, we won't do. So we don't do support, or we won't do manufacturing of certain products, or whatever. All you have to do, the idea of a policy is to state in advance the expectations in terms of behavior, which is why generally you should say in a policy, we don't give people choices, that we could do this, we should do that, the guideline is, no, that's ridiculous. You say what we will do and what we will not do, and you make sure that everybody knows that if it applies to them, they get a copy of it, and that normally it should apply to everybody anyway. So keep it simple, right?
You get rid of those, you get rid of that gray area.
Yeah,
where people start questioning, okay, well, it causes confusion.
Yeah, we're interested in your feedback, but quite frankly, no, we're not. You will do as you're told during a crisis, and the decisions about what we as a company will do will be taken by the CMT, full stop. Right? You could also put in the policy that the policy is that we have not defined in detail what crises are. This is the name of the coordinator in your area. If you think something's important, contact him and he'll tell you if we're going to have a CMT or not. Right? So it's got to be clear, it's got to be simple, and it's got to be straightforward. And there's no reason why it shouldn't be. But if you look at a lot of policy documents and guidance documents, already the word guidance is ridiculous. And we tend to use it far too much. It should. I don't see any use for the word guidance in anything. Right? We have guidance in building practice, for example. Why? Nobody knows. And the result is people do what they want. Guidance means I'll do what I like, and I'll justify it afterwards. That's not good. So the policy needs to be clear, crisp, simple, and people need to know that it applies to them. And when it comes to roles and responsibilities, you could put that in the policy. You could say there is a roles and responsibilities document, and you wouldn't put that in the policy because the policy needs to be short enough that it can be almost advertised. It should be somewhere where people know this is the policy, this is what happens. And you can say in your policy, we have a roles and responsibility document, which you can find here, and it'll say what the roles and responsibilities are of everybody. And there's no magic to that. You say that facilities management will be part of the CMT. Facilities management will control and coordinate everything to do with facilities. Any issue with facilities must be raised to them, and so on and so forth. Same with HR, same with legal, same with business unit managers. For example, in business unit managers, you're going to say to these guys, you're responsible for the relationship with customers. Okay. However, one very important thing that you need to make sure that you put in there, and we have seen thousands of examples of this not being done in the COVID situation, is that you need to make sure that in your roles and responsibilities that it's crystal clear who talks to who talks outside the company, and that's communications. Mm-hmm. And if you want to do the job properly, people who break the communication rule should be sacked. Your communication says that every piece of information that comes out of this organization to an external body goes through the communications department. Full stop. Now, we have. You watch you watch media like I watch media. You read the press. We've seen in COVID that you'll get one minister will stand up and say one thing, and two hours later, sometimes 2 minutes later, another minister stands up and contradicts him.
Yeah, right? It's here in Canada too.
We pay this all the time. You can't have that because Aeschylus, I think, in 486 said, and the first casualty of war is the truth. And as soon as especially with what appears to be a trend with the media these days. As soon as a bad rumor starts, deliberately or otherwise, deliberately there's not much you can do about it, but you can certainly make sure that what you say in terms of your company to your customers, to all of your stakeholders, to all of the resources you use, comes from one source, and everybody else keeps their mouth shut. That actually helps a great deal in the management of the crisis. Because for a simple reason, you don't spend management and CMT time repairing the damage from somebody saying something that they shouldn't have said. And you have to now spend a lot of time stroking people, correcting things. And once the genie's out of the bottle, you've had it. You can't get it back in. So the roles and responsibilities, the very first thing you can say is from now on, the only person who speaks outside from the CMT and the employees is the following person, following function. And it would actually be a pretty good idea to put in the policy that anybody who does not obey that loses their job.
Well, a lot of companies already have that, right? You can't represent the organization without proper authority or prior approval or something like that. So it should be applicable in a crisis situation if it's already applicable, on a daily basis.
Well, it is already applicable, and some companies, as you say, do have that in their policy. But we all know it's ignored.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in a crisis, the worst thing is that let's suppose we've got somebody who's in a stressful situation trying to deal with something, and he's badgered like 15 reporters.
Mm-hmm.
To say something wrong, and the reporters are going to exaggerate that, and in no time, and your competition is going to take advantage of that, and so on and so forth. It's a very, very, very difficult thing to manage, and especially in a crisis where things are moving quickly. And you see it all the time. People say things, and afterwards they say, they made a mistake, or as our American friends say, they misspoke. But no, it's very, very important then. Because I say, you're saving resources of your own by not having to manage the mess.
I do have a question about roles and responsibilities. With regards to the CMT and people's daily responsibilities, do you have any thoughts on, when a crisis management team gets activated, that people really shouldn't be or should be, depending on your opinion, assigned responsibilities that they don't already have? Why would I, working in marketing, all of a sudden be responsible to talk to facilities, and property management? Don't assign me things that I don't already do. Because I've seen that in crisis management teams. They throw all these people together and they're assigned responsibilities that they don't do on a daily basis. So they're kind of floundering.
I see what you mean. Yeah, I wouldn't. It's a good point. I think it would be dangerous to say to somebody in facilities, for example, you are now responsible for human resources as well, or all security, or something like that. No, I think people they should maintain their current roles. The only thing that they need to understand is that they're part of the CMC. They are sharing the joint responsibility, making decisions. To put somebody in a role that they can't handle is just silly. And this now we're talking about leadership. What does the CMT manager want? And it's up to him to choose the right roles and responsibilities for people in his team. I think the only thing that you need to be sure of is don't exclude anybody. Don't have 500 people in the CMT because decisions are going to be made quickly. But on the other hand, don't exclude anybody. Don't say, for example, we don't need anybody from marketing on the CMT. Yes, you do. Yes, you do. Or we don't need anybody from HR because, this has nothing to do with it. Yes, you do. You need somebody from every functional area in the company.
And I guess it's easier for those groups too to turn around and say, based on this situation, you just need to keep me in the loop. I don't really have any activity to play. Let them make that decision rather than forget them altogether and have a big problem suddenly appear.
Yeah, but they will be on the team. I mean, let's marketing, HR, sales, finance, these people are all part of the CMT, but they're going to be making decisions on behalf of the company instead of just for their functional area, and they're part of the team. And that's hard for some people to understand. It's hard because they've never behaved that way inside a company. And this is where the role of the CMT manager in terms of leading the team. And this is also where preparation of the way the CMT operates is important. I'm a great believer in checklists. So you should have a checklist of the things you're going to talk about. And at the end of this crisis, you will have extended that checklist and there'll be other things you need to talk about. But you put this checklist up and you go through these things point by point. If it's irrelevant, you don't say it's irrelevant, but you say, what's the issue? What should we do about it? What are we going to do about it? And who's going to do it? And you assign responsibility for individual points. But that's a framework to make sure that the CMT doesn't just get together and they say, everybody looks at each other and say, what should we talk about?
What do we do?
Put a checklist and say, right, item number 1. Who's dealing with security of employees' IT equipment, for example? Okay, who is dealing with the press? Who is dealing with the local authorities? Who is, etc. And you go through each of these things, and then things will come up that you haven't got on the checklist, and you modify your checklist. And that puts some structure into what potentially could just be, let's sit around a table and panic, which happens.
One of the other things we had on our agenda here is situation reporting. What did you mean by that, and what is that?
It's apparently a military term, which is which we use in crisis management. I think people should look at situation reporting not as a mechanism whereby you're going to be telling somebody something, it's a boring exercise of filling in paperwork and so on and so forth, situations. But view a situation report as a mechanism of getting resources. Okay, so you write a situation report to your senior management, the intent being to say, this is what's going on, these are the issues I'm facing, this is what I want from you. I'm not sending you this report because I like you, I'm sending you this report because I want something from you. And you want something from me in return. What you want from me is that the crisis is managed properly. You want to make sure that day by day I'm kept up to date. I'm your senior manager. So it's a fair exchange. I will say, you do this for me, and I'll do this for you. And people tend to sort of look at situation reports as just a reporting mechanism, and they don't take the final step of saying, as I think they probably would in military terms, we're going to do the following, but we need more resources. So you should deal with a situation report and mentally prepare yourself for the situation report. It's for that reason. And another way of looking at it as well, I mean, why would you write a senior situation report if it's not being sent to a senior management team? Well, a situation report can also be useful to send to your financiers. Okay? It can also be useful to send to the government. So, for example, you have a duty of care to employees. Well, make sure that your situation report covers what you're doing for employees. And then your situation report is something which you can use to demonstrate due care, attention, and duty of care towards employees. Write a situation report that says, this is what we're doing, this is the situation, it's under control. So when you go to the bank to get a credit line, the guy knows that this is not just a cry out of nowhere. This is a structured request based upon real information. So you say, yeah, I need a credit extension. This is what I'm doing. Okay, so the situation report, you either can look at it as an administrative pain in the butt, or you can look at it as an incredible tool to help you manage the crisis. So look at it as a tool.
Does every member of the crisis management team do that, or is
It should,
one,
the
one
situation, just one from the crisis. And usually a situation report would be written by somebody assigned by the CMT manager. So it would be written by a coordinator, and he gathers information about where we're standing, and he will, discuss the content of the situation report with the people in the meeting and say, okay, this is where we're at, this is what we're doing, this is the next step, okay, that's the situation report for today. Okay.
can that
So,
be used later on for lessons learned?
excuse me, say that again.
Can that be used later on for lessons learned?
Yes, obviously,
Yeah.
yes. At the end, at the very end of the crisis, lessons learned is a critical thing to do for certain. And yes, it will be used for that. Now, you mentioned earlier training, which is something I'm very sensitive about. It's like business continuity management training. Quite frankly, I'm not interested if somebody understands business continuity management or not. Okay, they're not there to understand continuity management. Training is there so that they can understand what they have to do. Crisis management training is exactly the same thing. Avoid, as people do, things like awareness and let's have a meeting to discuss and tell people, what a crisis is and all that sort of stuff. Quite frankly, it's a waste of time. All you need from somebody in crisis management training is that this is your role and this is what you have to do. This is what we're going to do. We're going to have a CMT. These are the roles and responsibilities of people. This is the way we're going to handle things. This is the process we're going to follow. This is the sort of checklist, etc., etc. And this is what you do. Okay. Now you may agree or disagree, but I don't care because the CMT has decided this is what you're going to do. And one thing that's good in a crisis management team training, because you need to train a team, is you build a scenario, you say what is going to happen, and you brought all the members of the CMT together. And when you start the training, the first thing you say is you point to the facilities manager who's in the meeting. You say, well, okay, you're not here. What happens? Now, his reaction should be, well, I will pass my responsibilities to my second. This is his name, this is his phone number, and during the training, you should call the second. And you should say, good morning, Mr. Second. You are standing in for the facilities manager today. And you can bet your life the guy's going to say, what? What are you talking about?
Yeah.
That's the first I've heard of it. Okay. So you can make these CMT training very, very effective using that sort of simple trick. Because everybody, a crisis, we don't have crises at 9 o'clock in the morning. They occur at 2 o'clock in the morning or at weekend. And so if somebody's in a CMT, the crisis management team manager should actually test this occasionally on Sunday morning at 7:30. He calls the guy from sales and says, by the way, we've got a problem. Can you be on the phone in 10 minutes? Right? And if the guy's not there, then he tries the next number on the list when this should all be documented. And you'll soon find out, and as we all know, that most CMTs don't work. They don't work because people don't know what they're meant to do. And they're not ready. And they don't think that crises happen at 7:30 on Sunday morning, but they do. And so on and so forth. So there's lots of tricks whereby people will get the message that I don't care whether you understand or you don't understand what the CMT is going to do or how we manage a crisis. Your role is the following, and that's what you've got to do. So training should focus not on awareness, should focus on making sure that people know what they have to do and what is expected of them. Nothing more, and certainly nothing less.
What happens if you find out that somebody, or I'll just say that somebody on the CMT isn't quite the right person to be there? I've run into a situation of that many years ago where, You could actually see it in the room. People looked around and said, "This isn't the right person to be representing that group," even though they were, you
The
know,
boss, the boss of the group.
yeah, they were the boss, but they weren't the right person to be there.
Somebody, the CMT manager's got to go along and say, "Listen, John, you're not the right guy. Now, this is the way I expect you to behave. And if you can't behave that way, then you probably shouldn't have the job you've got anyway."
Mm.
It's got to be dead straightforward to a person like that, and most people will rise to the challenge. But ignore it, and one day it'll come back and bite you. So tell them straight away.
How do you deal with the gaps and the issues that arise during a crisis or even during a test? Because sometimes it's a really delicate situation to try and report that we had a gap here and we couldn't actually address XYZ situation. How do you go about walking that minefield, that political minefield of saying, you guys did terrible? you know,
I think that you just said it. Somebody's got to say that. Somebody's got to say it to them. I mean, yes, you could have somebody who's not pulling their weight. You could have purely an identified gap, or who is actually responsible. Well, we don't actually have a functional manager who deals with that particular area, but we're a CMT now. So the issue is put onto the CMT notes. This is the issue. This is what we should do about it. This is who's going to do it. Elected by the CMT, and this is the result. So just a very simple bit of discipline. And of course, people have got to accept that CMTs will never be perfect. They'll make mistakes. The checklists won't be up to date. There'll be things you'll do wrong. Fine. The next time, maybe not. But if you don't document these things, you're not straightforward about it, you don't have a post-mortem at the end of the crisis, then you're kidding yourself, and it's just going to happen again. So it is possible to get better and better and better, very, very simply, just by being straightforward and clear.
So you kind of have to, I don't want to say be brutal, but you've got to be open and honest and say, you got to point out the gaps.
Absolutely, you've got to be open, and you've also got to follow a rule which I learned from Intel years and years and years ago, which is called disagree and commit. So you disagree with the decision, but you commit to do it anyway. And we were always told, you can disagree all you like, but you've got to commit. And most employees in the early days of Intel would do things they didn't agree with, but they would do them with 100% effort. And that's what you need from a CMT, disagree and commit. Yes, I am going to take the action to do something which is outside of my area of expertise. I'm not good at it, but I'm going to do my best, and I'm going to document what I do. And if I screw up, I screw up. Fine. Knowing that there will be no repercussions, because on Monday, when the crisis is over and the CMTs, I'm finished and back to my day job.
Right.
So it's managing crisis is simple, and as I say, if you want examples of how not to do it, well, I can point you to any number of countries that made such a hash of this virus crisis. Mm-hmm. It's an embarrassment, and I'm English, so you can get who I'm talking about.
I can.
It shouldn't happen. Anyway, okay.
Well, we only have 2.5 minutes left. Right. Do you have any final thoughts on crisis management?
Yeah, if you don't define a crisis to start with, you're going to fall into a situation where either everything is a crisis or nothing's a crisis, right? The nothing is a crisis is just as bad as everything's a crisis. Everything is a crisis that you always got somebody shouting, cry wolf, oh, we need to do this, we need to have a CMT for this and CMT for that, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. Now, that's bad. But when nothing is a crisis, that's probably worse. And it starts from defining what a crisis is and understanding that you and I can have different views of what a crisis is. The other thing as well is that people need to understand that the role of the organization changes when they become a member of the CMT. And a lot of people have a lot of trouble understanding that they are no longer just the sales manager. They are a senior manager of the company dealing with a situation which affects everybody. And that's not easy for some people to understand. And then the last thing I would say is that if you don't get your policy right and you don't make it absolutely crystal clear who's going to do what, especially in communications, you're digging yourself a hole. It's simple as that. And the more the longer it goes on, the more you will dig a hole.
You're doomed before you begin if you don't have a policy, right?
Yeah. And a clear policy. Let's say excluding words like should, could, maybe, guidelines, etc., etc. All those words should be deleted immediately. It should state clearly what you're going to do, when, how you're going to do it, who's going to do it. That's it, and who it applies to.
I'm sure many listeners right now probably have a whole bunch of those in their business continuity plans, crisis management plans, policies, evacuation plans. They are shoulds and maybes and all these and that. But Stuart, thank you very much for your time talking about crisis management. I do appreciate it.
Yep.
This is your second time here, so if you think of something else you'd like to talk about, please feel free. You've got an open door to come back and talk again.
Okay. Thanks, Alec. I hope it was useful.
Great. Oh, it was. I'm sure lots of people around the globe, will hopefully go back and hit the delete button on all those shoulds, especially. I think that's a really key piece because I see it everywhere, and I even hear it, in our daily life. Oh, that should work, will or won't, So thanks very much for your time. I really appreciate it. And to everybody listening or watching, in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody. If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave a message and let me know what your thoughts are. If you'd like to be a guest on the show to talk about something related to business continuity, disaster management, COVID, personal well-being, anything that's relatable to those subjects, you can reach me through my LinkedIn profile, which is in the video description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe. In the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.